Right now, in the stillness of your room, you may be staring into the dark with a heavy, disorienting ache that arrived when a future you completely trusted vanished overnight. Perhaps you are lying awake trying to process the sudden, unchosen ending of a relationship, the unexpected collapse of a long-term plan, or a sudden change that has left your life looking entirely unrecognizable. There is a specific, suffocating grief that takes hold when a structure you spent years meticulously building is violently torn apart by circumstances you could neither predict nor prevent. You might feel structurally undone tonight, replaying the exact moment of the rupture over and over, wondering how an entire landscape of security could splinter so rapidly, leaving you unanchored, exposed, and deeply terrified of the empty spaces where your expectations used to live. Let the surface beneath you carry the exhaustion of this heavy transition, noticing how the cool, humid air in your room carries a faint hint of distant moisture, like the heavy atmosphere of a coastal harbor. When the evening fog begins to roll in over the tide, the sharp noises of the world have faded into a low, continuous murmur, yet inside your mind, your thoughts may still be frantically pulling at the frayed, broken threads of your lost plans, trying to force the shattered fragments back into a shape that no longer exists. You are not broken because your life plan has shifted. What you are experiencing right now is not a personal failure, but the natural, agonizing protest of a mind that has mistaken its temporary creations for its permanent home. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be perfectly silent, nor will we demand that you magically heal the rupture or pretend the hurt did not happen. We are simply going to rest beside a calm harbor bay, learning how to stop tightening the knots of our own grief so that the heart can discover the natural peace of its own buoyancy. The mind does not recover from a sudden ending by aggressively forcing a broken situation back together, or by demanding an immediate answer from a silent future. True inner liberation begins with a surprising insight from Buddhist wisdom. The agonizing pain you feel tonight does not live inside the change itself, but in the rigid, unyielding attachment of your own ego to a specific structural form. We build a conceptual framework for our life, a perfect, tightly knotted net, designed to capture our security, our worth, and our happiness. And when the unstoppable current of impermanence tears that net open, we experience the rupture as a personal death. But the great paradox of suffering is that the original tear is only the first wound. The true exhaustion comes from the mind's desperate, angry effort to pull the torn fibers back into their old shape, warping the present moment under a mountain of resistance. Your life has not been ruined by this ending. It has simply been returned to the open ocean, where you are invited to realize that you were never the fragile net that broke, but the wide, indestructible water that can never be torn by holes. Take a slow, completely unhurried breath into the deepest part of your chest, letting the cool air expand your lungs like an open sail, and let it pass through your lips with a long, soft sigh, letting go of any obligation to fix your life in this hour. Right now, dear friend, nothing is required of you. No broken paths must be repaired tonight, and you do not have to solve your whole life before the sun rises. You are safe enough to soften the defensive tightness in your jaw, to let your shoulders drop completely away from your ears, and to give up the exhausting struggle of replaying what cannot be undone. In a moment, our journey will take us to a misty, salt-scented tidal village where an old deep-sea fisherman named Daigo helps a young man see why a ruined net cannot be mended by anger. This story will bring us closer to a quieter way of holding our losses, showing us how to float steady within the open spaces of an unchosen ending, where the body can finally let go of its resistance and drop into rest. For many seasons, a young line fisherman named Ren had lived in a small, weathered timber cottage built on barnacle-covered pilings at the edge of a deep harbour bay. Ren was a man of precise, meticulous habits who found his safety in structure, spending 3 long years hand-weaving a magnificent, massive hempen fishing net that was meant to secure his future for the rest of his days. Every knot was tied with absolute symmetry. Every mesh was measured down to the width of a finger, and the entire net was treated with dark, protective pine tar until it was strong enough to hold the heaviest harvest the deep ocean could offer. To Ren, this net was not merely a tool for his trade. It was the physical embodiment of his worth, his security, and the flawless future he had carefully mapped out for himself. But the ocean does not obey the rigid designs of the human heart. One midnight, while Ren was casting his net far beyond the safety of the harbour reef, an unpredicted, violent coastal gale swept over the water, churning the dark waves into towering walls of black foam. The massive net became entangled in a hidden field of jagged volcanic stone beneath the surface, and before Ren could release the heavy timbers of his boat, the ferocious pull of the current ripped the hempen structure completely apart, shredding the masterfully tied knots and tearing massive, jagged holes through the center of his life's work. By the time he managed to drag the ruined, waterlogged remnants back onto his wooden deck, the beautiful form of his future had been completely shattered, leaving him staring at a tangled, useless pile of frayed strings in the grey morning light. Devastated and consumed by a cold, disorienting grief, Ren locked himself inside his dark shore shack, refusing to look at the sea or speak to the people of the village. He spent his days sitting on a low wooden bench beneath a dim oil-wick lamp, his fingers raw and bleeding as he frantically pulled at the frayed ends of the hemp, trying to tie the torn threads back together by sheer force of will. But because he was working from a place of deep bitterness and anger, his movements were rigid and tense. Every time he tried to force a broken knot back into its old position, the surrounding mesh would warp, pull tight, and shrink, causing the entire net to bunch together into a stiff, distorted mass that could no longer lay flat or move freely. The more he fought to reconstruct the past, the more tangled and restricted his present became, until the ruined net felt like a heavy iron cage, trapping him inside his own sorrow. One evening, as the distant foghorns began to echo through the thick harbour mist, the heavy timber door of the shack creaked open, and Elder Daigo stepped quietly inside, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud against the salt-encrusted floorboards. The old retired fisherman did not offer a grand speech of consolation, nor did he tell Ren that everything would be easily repaired. He simply stood in the dim light, the rich scent of brine and old sea stone radiating from his thick wool cloak, his deep weather lines crinkling as he looked down at the warped, tangled mess that Ren was gripping so tightly in his lap. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a smooth copper netting needle wrapped in dark, tarred twine, and laid it quietly on the edge of the wooden bench. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. Elder Daigo reached down and placed his rough, calloused palm directly over Ren's white-knuckled fingers, gently but firmly guiding the young man to stop pulling at the frayed cord. "Look at what your hands are doing, Ren," the old man said, his voice low and resonant, carrying the steady, unhurried cadence of the incoming tide. "You are so angry at the ocean for tearing your net that you are using your own strength to strangle the wood. You think you are repairing the structure, but your resistance is what is making it stiff. Come down to the water's edge and let us see what happens when we stop trying to force a dead shape to live." And this is where the mind begins to soften. The dim lantern light in the corner of the small shore shack flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls of rough-hewn pine. Ren remained seated on the edge of the low wooden bench, his knuckles white, his chest heaving with a shallow, ragged rhythm that matched the rising panic in his thoughts. In his lap lay the heap of shredded hemp, its tarred fibers coarse and unyielding against his skin. Every single tear in the mesh felt like a jagged wound. In his own identity, every broken knot was an accusation, a tangible proof that the future he had so carefully guarded had been stolen from him by a single night of unreasoning storm. Across from him, Elder Daigo did not move to touch the rope, nor did he offer any superficial phrases to downplay the devastation. His large salt-crusted hands simply rested on his knees, his posture as grounded and steady as the ancient stone breakwater that sheltered the village boats from the open ocean. The air inside the small room was thick with the scent of damp wool, heavy pintar, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold sea brine that clung to the floorboards. For several minutes, the only sound was the low, rhythmic groan of the pier timbers outside, creaking as the deep harbour tide moved beneath them in the dark. Ren reached down and picked up the copper netting needle that the old man had placed on the bench, his fingers instantly tightening around its cold, smooth, metallic spine. He held it like a weapon against his own despair, intending to drive the needle through a tangled nest of cords, determined to force a knot into submission. But as he pulled the thread taut, the adjacent rows of hemp gave way with a sharp, brittle snap, the tension causing the entire section to bunch up into an even tighter, more distorted mass. A bitter groan escaped his lips, his shoulders hunching forward as he stared at the fresh ruin his own hands had just created in the dim light. "Let us carry this outside," Elder Daigo murmured, his voice falling through the dark shack with the heavy, unhurried resonance of a rolling swell. "The air in here is stagnant. Ren, it is full of old arguments. The net cannot tell you its true nature while you are holding it in a fist." The old fisherman stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unbothered by the chill, and reached down to lift one side of the heavy, wet mass of hemp. Ren, numb with exhaustion, gathered the rest of the ruined net into his arms, its waterlogged weight dragging against his thighs like an anchor chain as they walked out onto the slick, moss-covered planks of the dark wooden pier. The harbour fog had settled completely over the water now, erasing the horizon and turning the anchored fishing boats into silent, floating ghosts that rocked gently in the dark indigo bay. The skin on Ren's face tingled as the cold coastal mist touched his cheeks, carrying the raw, earthy smell of wet kelp and exposed mudflats. They walked to the very end of the pier, where the deep harbour water remained sheltered from the crashing surf outside the reef, forming a still, black tidal pool that reflected nothing but the faint, the misty grey of the low clouds. Elder Daigo stopped beside a heavy timber piling encrusted with small white barnacles. He did not ask Ren to begin weaving anew. He did not tell him to use the copper needle to fix the holes. Instead, with a gentle, sweeping gesture of his rough arm, the old man guided Ren to simply let the entire tangled, warped mass of hemp slip out of his grip and fall straight down into the dark, quiet water of the harbour basin. Ren felt a sharp spike of resistance catch in his throat, his hands instinctively wanting to clutch the rope tightly to his chest, terrified that if he let it go into the black depth, the current would carry away the last remnants of his life's work. But the weight was too great, and the old man's steady presence offered a strange, unyielding permission to surrender the struggle. Ren opened his palms. The heavy, tarred net slid over the wet timber edge with a soft, splashing hiss, sinking immediately beneath the surface of the quiet pool. Ren leaned over the wooden railing, his breath coming in faint white plumes in the night air, watching the dark shape of his ruined future descend into the water. He expected to see it sink like a stone, gathering into a tighter, more hopeless knot at the bottom of the bay. But as the hemp settled into the deep harbour pool, a completely unexpected transformation began to occur within the dark water. Free from the frantic, tightening grip of Ren's raw fingers, the waterlogged fibres began to loosen on their own. The natural buoyancy of the water crept into the tight, defensive knots that Ren had tied in his anger. Slowly, effortlessly, the warped sections of the mesh began to unfurl, the loose ends drifting outward like dark seagrass in a gentle current. The massive, jagged holes that had looked so catastrophic in the dim light of the shack did not disappear, but they no longer looked like a tangled crisis. The calm harbour water moved completely through the gaps, filling the open spaces between the threads, balancing the weight of the hemp, so that the entire structure floated loosely, suspended in the quiet depth, completely unburdened by the shape it had lost. Elder Daigo stood in the mist, his eyes fixed on the floating hemp beneath the surface, his breathing slow and peaceful. "Look at the net now. Ren," the old man whispered, the sound of his voice blending perfectly with the lapping of the tide against the wood. "When it was up in your room, your anger was trying to force it to be straight, and every pull of your hand made the rope suffer. But out here, the ocean does not care that the net is torn. The water does not demand that the knots be perfect before it holds the weight." Ren knelt on the wet planks of the pier, his gaze locked on the loose, drifting threads below. For months, he had believed that his deep, disorienting grief was a proof that his life was permanently ruined, a failure that he had to repair. Through endless, agonizing willpower, he had been staying awake for weeks inside the dark shack of his own thoughts, trying to force a shattered plan to become whole again, while his own resistance was the very thing that was warping his mind into a cage. Looking down into the dark water, he saw that the net was still torn. The holes were still real, yet it was completely at peace, cradled by the immense depth of the harbour pool. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter. But as Ren watched the hemp float weightlessly in the tide, his own chest began to mirror that open space. And this is where the mind begins to soften, the deep stillness that settled over the harbour pool. as Wren's shredded net floated beneath the surface, is a quietness that is available to you right now in the very room where you are listening. As you lie here in the shadows, let the image of that submerged, untangling hemp sink slowly into your awareness, softening the rigid edges of your thoughts. This ancient harbor narrative is not telling us to stop feeling our profound human grief, nor is it asking us to become cold, unfeeling statues who look at a shattered life plan with indifference. Buddhist wisdom never demands that you freeze your heart into an icy wasteland where disappointment cannot touch you. It is not an instruction to reject the beautiful dreams you had for your future, or to pretend that a sudden, agonizing ending does not leave a real, piercing ache within your bones. Instead, it is revealing an inner landscape that is infinitely quieter, an emotional sanctuary that alters how we carry our ruins. It is showing us that the exhausting, suffocating weight you are carrying tonight does not actually reside inside the simple fact of the ending itself. The true suffering lives in the specific, hypervigilant way the mind has chosen to hold that rupture, turning a temporary crisis into a permanent prison of identity. Think of your own life and the broken structures you have been frantically replaying in the dark before you found the steady rhythm of this voice. When we experience a sudden termination, a relationship that shatters without warning, a career path that closes overnight, or a future that vanishes from our grasp, that event occurs in a specific, limited interval of time. It is a midnight storm that passes over our deck. Yet, we carry that wreckage into the stillness of our bedrooms, and we spend our nights using our thoughts like a rigid copper needle, frantically pulling at the frayed ends, tightening our resentment, and twisting our memories into a tight knot of resistance to prevent the world from ever catching us unprotected again. One of the great insights of the Buddha was that our deepest torment does not grow from the unchosen changes that life delivers to our shoreline, but from the heavy, extra layers of judgment that our own thoughts fasten onto those changes. In the foundational path of this wisdom, we discover that the heart is frequently subjected to two entirely separate injuries. The first wound is what actually happened, the door that closed, the word that was spoken, the sudden realization that the path you spent 3 years weaving has been torn out of your hands by reality. This first wound is a real, unavoidable flash of pain. It is the jagged rock tearing the net. We cannot always predict when the ocean currents will shift, nor can we force the world to honor the exact blueprints we drew for our happiness. But the second wound is entirely self-made. The second wound is the decision to sit in the dark shack of our overthinking and use our vital heat to strangle the rope, telling ourselves that because our plan broke, our entire life is an unmitigated failure, destined to remain forever ruined and unanchored in the fog. The first injury causes a natural pang of sorrow. The second habit turns that sorrow into a lifelong cage. When we translate these ancient reflections into our modern emotional reality, we can begin to see what attachment and craving truly look like when they operate inside a sudden ending. Attachment is not a gentle expression of love or ambition. It is the rigid, unyielding posture of the mind that states, the future must look exactly like my blueprint, or my body is not permitted to relax its shoulders. Tonight, it is the desperate, silent craving to possess a perfect guarantee against the vulnerability of change, a frantic demand that the unstoppable ocean of life must stop moving before we are safe enough to rest. When we crave control over a landscape that has already shifted, we are behaving exactly like Wren trying to force a waterlogged, torn mesh to lay flat through sheer anger. The more aggressively we pull at the broken threads of a lost relationship or a vanished position, the tighter the surrounding knots become, and the more violently our own resistance warps our present peace, leaving our hearts strangled by the very structures we built to secure our worth. True. Letting go does not mean that you abandon your capacity to care, or that you throw away your history as if it never mattered, or that you pass through life like a ghost that never touches the earth. Letting go is simply the somatic realization that your true nature is not an isolated, fragile net that can be permanently ruined by a single tear. In the deeper current of Buddhist psychology, the illusion that your identity is a rigid, functional tool designed to capture a specific harvest is the core generator of all your panic. We spend our lives believing that if our structure breaks, we will sink to the bottom and disappear forever. But when you look at the hemp floating in the harbor pool, you see that when the frantic grip of control releases its hold, the net does not vanish, it expands. The water moves completely through the tears, filling the empty spaces, balancing the weight, and revealing that the ocean was never your enemy. Mindfulness is the ability to stand at the edge of the pier and watch the torn sections of your life float in the depth without rushing down to pull them into a tighter knot. Impermanence is the gentle reminder that no ending stays fixed as a tragedy unless we spend our nighttime energy weaving a prison to keep the grief from moving. Awareness is the quiet, undisturbed space that can notice the heavy presence of disappointment without choosing to become the disappointment. Right now, in the safety of this dark room, your awareness is infinitely larger than the specific patterns of overthinking that have been pacing the floor of your mind. You are fully capable of witnessing the hollow ache in your stomach, the constriction in your chest, and the terrifying uncertainty of tomorrow, without allowing those passing waves to dictate the current depth of your breathing. A thought of failure can drift through your mind in the dark, but if you do not provide a rigid wall of resistance for it to strike against, it has nowhere to catch. It passes through the open mesh of your awareness, leaving the deep timber of your true being completely untouched by its passage. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. When we meet our shattered plans with the warmth of genuine compassion, we stop treating our wounded heart as a broken object that must be aggressively chiseled back into shape through self-hatred. We can look at our habit of pulling at the frayed ends and isolating ourselves in our dark rooms, not as a failure of our character, but as the tired, deeply human attempt of a vulnerable soul trying to find a moment of safety in a world that has suddenly felt chaotic and cold. We can look at our empty spaces with a soft, forgiving tenderness, recognizing that the net only floats because it has ceased to fight the water. Just as Elder Daigo showed the young fisherman, the ocean does not possess a personal desire to ruin your work. The current is simply moving where it must move. And when the hemp stops resisting the tide, the very space where the structure broke becomes the place where it is perfectly sustained. The liberating truth of this wisdom reminds us that you do not have to fix your entire life story before you are allowed to let your eyes become heavy tonight. The deep space within your chest has never been genuinely broken by the disruptions of your year, just as the inherent cleanliness of the deep harbor pool was never compromised by the torn rope that descended into its stillness. Your original nature is vast, unconfined, and entirely independent of whether your plans succeeded or fell apart in the storm. By choosing to let the rock-weighted frame of your expectations sink into the deep undercurrent of your simple presence, you are not denying your loss. You are simply refusing to spend another midnight using your history as a weapon against your own heart. You are giving the crust of your resistance permission to turn soft, allowing the old knots to loosen into an immense, unmonitored tranquility. In a moment, this journey will guide us into a quiet physical practice based on the lesson of the floating net, offering your body a gentle pathway to unfasten the remaining tension and breathe in alignment with the deep water. But before we begin that soft meditation, let your mind rest completely within this single assurance. You do not have to rebuild your future tonight to deserve a soft mattress, a quiet room, and an undisturbed rest. And this is where the mind begins to soften. If it feels right, let your attention drift completely away from the world of explanations and concepts, allowing your awareness to drop down into the immediate, living landscape of your physical frame as it rests here tonight. There is no need to analyze how deeply you are relaxing, and there is no standard of perfect meditative stillness that you must achieve to be worthy of this space. We are not setting out to change your state of mind through an act of aggressive willpower, nor are we demanding that you banish the lingering ghosts of your shattered expectations. We are simply turning our face toward the immediate texture of the evening, giving the body full permission to step off the hard highway of the day's anxieties. Notice the honest, unyielding weight of your hips, your shoulder blades, and the back of your head as they sink into the surface beneath you. You do not have to carry the structure of your life. Right now, the bed supporting you is entirely capable of holding your fatigue, your disorientation, and your grief without requiring a single ounce of your effort. Take an unhurried invitation to notice your breathing, letting the air arrive through your nose, without forcing it into a rigid or artificial cadence. There is no virtue in counting the seconds of your inhalation, nor do you need to shape your breath into a perfect, symmetrical pattern. You might simply observe the soft, natural expansion of your rib cage, a subtle widening of the spaces between your ribs, followed by the slow, effortless deflation that happens when you stop gripping the air. With each quiet exhalation, you might imagine that the outer boundary of your chest is becoming just a little less rigid, like old, tarred hemp that has been returned to the gentle wash of a calm harbor pool, allowing its tight fibers to loosen their grip on the dark. As you lie here in the shadows, you might become aware of one specific memory, one persistent image of an unchosen ending, or one heavy thought of failure that has been pacing the floor of your mind tonight. Do not try to violently push this thought out of your awareness, and do not judge yourself for carrying the ache of a broken plan into your bed. Shaming yourself for feeling unanchored is only another way of trying to use a copper needle to force a torn net into submission, adding a fresh layer of tightness to a heart that is already profoundly tired. Instead, look at this familiar emotional pattern with a sense of gentle, uncritical curiosity, as if you were observing a piece of weathered driftwood resting on a dark shoreline. What does it actually feel like inside the physical borders of your skin when this memory of loss rises to the surface? Perhaps there is a cold, heavy contraction right in the center of your chest, a tightness in the back of your throat, or a hollow, disorienting ache in the pit of your stomach. Even noticing these small physical markers is enough You do not have to dissolve them or cure them to be safe in this darkness. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal within the quiet architecture of your own breath. Perhaps, if it feels right, you might imagine that your own torso is like that masterfully woven fishing net drifting loosely underwater. In the deep harbor basin, see the framework of your spine and your ribs standing, not as a rigid cage designed to trap your security, but as a soft open weave that is completely submersed in a dark, supportive sea of awareness. For weeks, or perhaps for many months, your thoughts have been pulling frantically at the frayed edges of this structure, trying to knot the broken pieces back together through endless loops of regret and self-reproach. But right now, in the safety of this quiet room, you can allow your hands to drop the copper needle of control completely. You can let the tension go. There is no need to force the torn mesh of your life back into its old shape tonight. Let the frayed threads of your lost future drift outward into the cool, dark water of the present moment, leaving the entire structure of your being open, loose and fluid. Imagine placing that heavy, persistent worry about your future directly into the smooth, circular sea stone weight that rests at the bottom of the bay. You are applying absolutely no pressure to this memory. Your attention is merely a soft, warm current moving around it, watching how the water interacts with the open space where your plan used to live. When the cold tide of your uncertainty sweeps through your awareness tonight, do not try to close the mesh and do not try to tighten the fibers to keep the water out. Just let the current move completely through the gaps in your chest, flowing in one side of your ribs and out the other, passing through the tears without finding any rigid, defensive surface to break or drag down. Notice what happens to the density of your overthinking when you give up the habit of fighting the rupture, without the hard, tight boundaries of your resistance to bounce against. The sharp, stinging edge of that sudden ending begins to blur and widen in the dark. The memory of your loss doesn't ruin your structure. It simply turns into a loose, floating movement that sways gently within the immense depth of your breathing, blending perfectly with the natural vastness of the evening. The thought of being broken is losing its power to torment you, turning from an invading crisis into a neutral thread that floats weightlessly in a calm harbor pool. You are not destroying the grief. You are simply giving it so much spaciousness that it can no longer find a tight, constricted corner to strangle your breath. Perhaps you might realize that when you stop trying to force a shattered plan to look whole, the terrifying void left behind by the ending begins to transform on its own. The empty space in your life is no longer a desert that proves you are ruined. It is the very water that allows your soul to float, connecting your heart to the indestructible current of life that moves beneath all human structures. By allowing your lungs to remain porous and open, like a torn net that has ceased to fight the sea, you let the residue of your difficult transition pass completely through your skin without leaving a new scar behind. You can return to this soft, buoyant touch. Whenever you are ready, there is no penalty for drifting back into the old shacks of your regret, and no failure if your mind tries to pull the knots tight again a few minutes from now. Each time the contraction returns to your throat, you can simply notice the tightness, drop the needle, and let the water move through. Let the image of the harbor pool change very slowly now, fading back into the deep, warm familiarity of your actual blanket and the quiet weight of your pillow, leaving you with nothing but the immediate physical reality of this passing hour. The room around you remains entirely safe and still. The world outside continues its slow, unmonitored movement through the dark, completely unbothered by the complex structures we build in our thoughts to capture our worth. You do not have to rebuild your entire career, your relationship, or your security before you are allowed to let your eyelids become heavy. True peace is not a distant harbor that you must reach through desperate, exhausting weaving. It is the quiet, buoyant space of awareness that has been cradling you all along, waiting for you to trust its depth. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, returning to that misty tidal village to discover what happened when the winter frosts grew deeper and how a smooth sea stone with a hole worn through its center revealed a deeper layer of transformation, a path that shows us how to stand steady within the open spaces of a shattered life without needing to capture a single thing to be whole. But for now, let yourself simply rest in this intermediate space, where the outlines of your old expectations are losing their sharp edges, and your limbs are becoming beautifully heavy, sinking down into the deep, welcoming stillness of the bed. The autumn harbor grew increasingly quiet as the weeks deepened into winter. The salt spray turning to a thin, brittle crust of ice along the dark edges of the wooden slips. Wren had stopped his frantic, Latinite attempts to force the shredded hemp threads back into the old grid of his lost plans. He no longer spent his mornings locked away in the stagnant air of his shore shack, trying to undo what the midnight ocean gale had already taken. Yet, as he sat on the frost-dusted timbers of the dock each morning, watching the older fishermen haul in their daily silver catch, using whole functional nets, a new and heavier shadow began to settle across his heart. It was the quiet, agonizing sting of feeling completely left behind by life, a silent conviction that because his major plan had ruptured, he was now an empty, useless spectator whose season of usefulness had permanently passed. The young fisherman had fallen into a very subtle, hidden loop of self-reproach. While he had accepted that the old net was torn, he had turned that very rupture into his new personal identity. He began to look at himself, not as a person navigating a difficult transition, but as a structurally broken man, an outsider destined to drift aimlessly in the fog while the rest of the village moved forward into the harvest. He would watch the boats slide gracefully past the harbor reef, their oars slicing the water with rhythmic confidence, and he would tell himself, they belong to the sea. I am only the debris left on the rocks. He was using the quiet lesson of surrender to build a passive, bitter wall between his soul and the world, mistaking a state of frozen hopelessness for the fluid peace of true letting go. He had stopped fighting the past, but he had begun to treat the emptiness of his present as a lifelong sentence of unworthiness. One exceptionally cold twilight, when the incoming tide carried large, slow swirls of grey slush from the northern marshes, Elder Daigo walked down the slick path to the very end of the long wooden pier. The old man was not carrying any fresh line, and he did not bring any tools for weaving. Instead, wrapped in his heavy, oilskin cloak that smelled of salt crust and dried kelp, he carried a single, heavy object in his rough palm. It was a smooth, perfectly circular sea stone, weathered down by decades of oceanic friction, until it was flat and dark indigo, with a clean, natural hole worn directly through its center by the continuous wash of the tides. Beside it, he laid a short piece of thick, unrefined coconut fiber rope. Elder Daigo did not offer a complex lecture on the danger of turning grief into a monument, nor did he ask Ren why he had been sitting on the docks for weeks, with his arms crossed over his chest. He simply handed the young man the smooth sea stone and pointed out toward a small, flat-bottomed work skiff that was rocking unevenly against the barnacle-covered pilings at the end of the slip. The skiff was empty, except for the waterlogged remnants of Ren's torn, hempen net, which had been resting at the bottom of the boat, loose and unknotted ever since they had lifted it from the still harbour pool. The old man indicated with a silent nod that the skiff must be taken out into the centre of the deep bay, where the harbour fog was currently dropping so low that the village lanterns were beginning to blur into tiny, distant smudges of orange light. Ren climbed into the wet boat, his boots slipping slightly on the frosty wood, his heart tightening with the familiar, suffocating panic of staring into an uncertain, formless future. He took up the heavy ash oars, his cold fingers tracing the rough grain, as he rowed them slowly out into the open basin of the bay, where the dark indigo water was completely still, unmoving under the weight of the winter mist. When they reached the deepest part of the harbour floor, far from the safety of the pilings, Elder Daigo gestured for Ren to stop rowing. The old man reached down, picked up the smooth sea stone weight, and handed it back to Ren along with the coconut fibre cord. "Tie this stone to the lower edge of the loose, torn hemp," Daigo whispered, his voice low and raspy, carrying the steady, unhurried resonance of the deep ocean swells, "and then lower the whole net straight down into the black water beneath us." Ren looked at the old fisherman with a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. He muttered that there was no purpose in sinking a ruined net that possessed no functional knots to trap the fish, that the stone would only drag the hemp down into the mud where it would be lost forever in the dark. He felt that by dropping an already broken structure into the deep void, he was finally admitting that his life was completely empty, a useless fragment that had no value left to offer the village. The old man simply pointed toward the water, his posture completely unbothered by the thick, biting chill of the harbour fog. "Just tie the weight, Ren, and let the space do the catching." Ren hesitated, taking a single, long, deliberate breath into the very centre of his chest, letting his shoulders drop away from his ears as he felt the cold salt air enter his lungs. He stopped trying to find a logical explanation for the old man's request, and instead, he slowly threaded the coconut cord through the natural hole in the centre of the dark sea stone. He fastened it firmly to the frayed, open hem of the torn net. With a slow, unhurried movement of his raw hands, he lifted the heavy stone and lowered it over the side of the skiff, allowing the waterlogged, loose mass of hemp to slide after it, down into the silent, black depths of the bay. As the net descended into the dark indigo water, Ren leaned over the gunwale, his breath rising in thin white plumes against the winter sky, fully expecting the rope to tangle and vanish into a useless heap of misery. But as the heavy sea stone reached the length of the line, a subtle, beautiful transformation began to reveal itself. Within the deep current, the stone did not drag the net into a compressed knot of ruin. Because the stone was heavy and flat, it acted as a steady, quiet anchor, pulling the long, vertical threads of the net downward into a straight, fluid line while the natural buoyancy of the water lifted the top edge toward the surface. The net did not look like a broken tool anymore. It hung in the deep harbor current, like a vast, weightless curtain of soft shadow, moving gracefully with the breath of the tide. The massive, jagged holes that Wren had spent weeks grieving were still completely there. The structure was still entirely torn, yet it was no longer useless. Because it was open and loose, the strong, freezing undertow of the bay could pass completely through the gaps without resistance, leaving the boat completely of the fog, unbothered by the current that would have capsized a rigid, closed net. And as Wren watched the water move through the open spaces of the mesh, he noticed that small, silver estuary fish were swimming peacefully through the tiers, using the loose hemp as a safe sanctuary from the predators of the open sea. A profound, quiet realization washed over Wren's chest, loosening the tight muscles around his ribs. For the first time in many months, he stopped treating his thoughts of failure as an absolute truth. He saw that the ocean did not require him to be a perfect, unbroken net to have a place within its depth. The transformation did not happen because his old plan had been magically repaired, or because he had woven a new fortune out of his regret. The transformation happened in the single, quiet second he stopped trying to use his life to capture and control the sea, and instead allowed his broken structure to become a spacious sanctuary. For what was already here, he took up the oars with a slower grip, his mind no longer treating his unchosen ending as a personal cage, but as an open, fluid doorway back to the deep water. And this is where the mind begins to soften. The deep stillness that cradled the flat-bottomed work skiff out in the freezing center of the bay is the exact same spaciousness that is waiting for you right now within the quiet sanctuary of your own room. As you lie here in the shadows of the evening, let your awareness settle completely back into the immediate physical reality of your own body, noticing the slow, effortless rise and fall of your chest against the dark. The external world outside your window may still be filled with unpredictable weather, and your personal history may contain chapters that you wish had been written with a gentler ink. We cannot always reach backward through the river of time to prevent our nets from tearing or to undo the moments where a sudden ending left us feeling entirely exposed and unanchored in the fog. But we can look directly into the deep, exhausting, emotional mechanism that keeps the mind spinning in the dark, and we can choose to change our entire relationship with the empty space. Have you ever wondered why the mind feels such a compulsive late-night urge to turn its losses into a solid identity? Why do we sit in the dark and obsessively trace the spaces where our plans ruptured, compiling a detailed record of our perceived failures, as if building a magnificent monument to our own brokenness could somehow keep us safe? We do this because the human ego operates under a profound, universal misunderstanding. It confuses the tight, rigid grip of resistance with actual security. When you experience a sudden rupture, a door that slams without warning, a contract that falls through, or a person who walks out of your life, a raw, terrifying vulnerability opens up in your core. The mind, terrified of being caught, unprepared by uncertainty again, immediately sets to work. It starts to rehearse the future, plotting how it will avoid the deep water next time, or it replays the past, hunting through old conversations to find the precise mistake that caused the storm. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal. When we examine this defensive pattern, through the clear lens of Buddhist insight, we can begin to see the exact emotional gears that turn a passing change into a lifetime of chronic suffering. One of the most liberating realizations of this path is the understanding that there is a vast difference between the first pain that life brings to your shoreline and the second pain that your own thoughts fasten onto that injury. The first pain is the original rupture, the phone call that changes everything, the empty chair, the sudden freezing ocean gale that shreds your carefully woven knots. This first pain is a temporary, unavoidable phenomenon that belongs to the natural friction of being a sensitive soul in a changing universe. We cannot always control when the tides of impermanence will shift, nor can we force the deep sea to respect the exact blueprints we drew for our happiness. But the second pain, the heavy, suffocating weight that keeps you awake tonight, is entirely generated by the mind's refusal to let reality be what it already is. The second pain is the continuous internal commentary that tells you that because your net broke, your entire life is an unmitigated disaster, that you are structurally insufficient, and that you are destined to drift aimlessly as a piece of useless debris in the fog. We believe that by using self-judgment and shame as tools to audit our flaws, we are somehow working toward our own protection. We treat our sensitive heart like a broken piece of hemp that must be aggressively knotted, pulled and hidden away from the world until it is flawless enough to be seen. But this is the ultimate tragedy of control. Trying to fix an unchosen ending through shame is like trying to dry a wet net by lock-sealing it in a dark iron chest. It does not repair the fibers, it only hardens your inner landscape until your mind forgets that it is already being cradled by the deep, supportive water. What if the hollow, disorienting ache you are carrying in your stomach tonight is not a proof that you are ruined, but simply a temporary pocket of space that you have been trying to fight with the wrong tools? In our modern lives, we are taught that our value is determined by what we can capture, hold, and display to the world as proof of our success. We turn our expectations into a series of borders to be guarded, using our life plans like rigid grids to measure our security. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that true peace is never found by successfully building an unbreakable wall against change. Peace is the radical, quiet willingness to realize that you do not have to be an intact, flawless tool of capture to have value on this earth. You are a living, breathing expression of awareness, completely woven into the current hour, sustained by a depth that can never be ruined by holes. True transformation does not happen because you have finally figured out a brilliant argument to guarantee your future against disappointment. Peace is not the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a magical state where no plan of yours ever fails again. Peace is an entirely different way of sitting with the uncertainty. It begins in the exact second you drop the copper needle of self-reproach and stop treating every anxious thought as an absolute command that you must obey. When an old memory of collapse walks into your mind in the dark, you do not have to build a frantic wall around it to keep out the draft. You do not have to plead guilty. In the internal courtroom of your overthinking, you can simply stand as that open, water-weighted frame, allowing the freezing current of that feeling to move entirely through your ribs without finding any tight, defensive surface to tear to pieces. You do not have to solve the immense puzzle of your shattered future before you are permitted to let your eyelids become heavy tonight. The deep space within your chest has never been genuinely compromised by the disruptions of your year, just as the inherent cleanliness of the deep harbor basin was never ruined by the torn net that descended into its stillness. Your original nature is vast, fluid, and entirely independent of whether your plans succeeded or fell apart in the coastal gale. By choosing to let the rock-weighted frame of your expectations sink into the deep undercurrent of your simple presence, you are not admitting defeat. You are simply refusing to spend another midnight using your history as a weapon against your own heart. You are giving the crust of your resistance permission to turn soft, allowing your presence to blend perfectly with the deep, unmonitored tranquility of the evening. Let your whole frame settle into the absolute honest support of the surface beneath you, acknowledging that for this one night, you have done enough weaving. There are no critics hiding. In the shadows of this room, there is no tribunal waiting to audit your progress, and there is no ledger requiring you to prove your value before the sun rises. You are completely safe to unfasten the heavy layers of your hypervigilance. Let the small muscles around your eyes release their grip. Let your belly expand with a quiet, unforced spaciousness, and allow your attention to rest entirely on the outer lip of your breath. In a moment, this ancient wisdom will step directly into the small, ordinary details of your daily routine, showing you how to walk through tomorrow's world without treating every empty space as a crisis. But for now, let yourself simply be the deep harbor bay that watches the fog move past, a place where the water can finally run out of boundaries, and this is where the mind begins to soften. Now let this wisdom come closer to your own life, moving out of the quiet work skiff and into the ordinary, chaotic moments that await you when the sun rises tomorrow. We often believe that deep spiritual transformation requires us to retreat forever onto a silent harbor pier or live in an isolated coastal shack away from the noise of modern life. But the true arena for this softness is not an ancient harbor. It is found in the middle of a stressful afternoon, during a difficult conversation with someone who refuses to see your perspective, or in the quiet panic that takes hold when you check your phone for reassurance and find only silence. These are the modern waves that pull at the edges of your day, and it is precisely here, in these unglamorous spaces, that you are invited to choose a completely different way of resting within your own skin. Think of how we navigate our daily routines now, carrying a small, glowing screen in our palms that connects us instantly to the timelines, achievements, and sudden departures of everyone we know. When you open an app and see your peers effortlessly advancing through their careers, celebrating milestones, or building relationships that seem flawlessly intact, a sudden chill can move through your thoughts. You might feel instantly behind in life, as if you missed a silent signal that everyone else heard, leaving you stranded on a solitary dock while the rest of humanity sails toward a bright horizon. In the past, your immediate reaction might have been to pull frantically at the threads of your own life, replaying old professional mistakes, tracking your age against an invisible map of success, or trying to force a closing relationship to stay open through an act of sheer, desperate control. This Latinite overthinking is nothing more than your mind trying to use a copper needle to force a torn net into submission, tightening your own anxiety until even your breath feels restricted. Perhaps you have spent many days pretending to be completely okay, walking through crowded offices or family gatherings, with a polite smile fixed upon your face, while carrying a heavy, disorienting ache of insufficiency right beneath your ribs. You may be profoundly tired from the daily performance of competence, exhausted from trying to convince the world and yourself that your life plan is perfectly whole and that you never feel unanchored in the fog. When you sit at a modern desk or lie awake in the dark, checking your device for a message that never arrives, you are consuming your vital energy trying to manage an unchosen ending that has already occurred. You treat the empty space in your life like a catastrophic flaw, a personal failure that you must hide away in shame until you are strong enough to fix it. But look at the modern landscape around you. With a soft, forgiving tenderness, every single person you pass on the street is secretly carrying their own torn mesh, their own unknotted disappointments, and their own hidden terror of uncertainty. Consider what happens when you want to rest during the day, but feel an immediate, biting layer of guilt for taking a pause, telling yourself that because your plans are currently fractured, you have not yet earned the right to step off the wheel. We have been conditioned to believe that we must always be capturing, producing, or mending our fortunes before we are permitted to soften our posture. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that peace is not an award given to those who have successfully woven an unbreakable life. Peace is practiced in small, unadorned moments of ordinary daily discipline. Taking a single, long breath before you answer a demanding email or reply to a cold text is a profound act of spiritual wisdom. It is a quiet choice to let the uncarved shingle or the raw stone meet the moisture of the hour exactly as it is, stopping the ancient habit of treating every fearful thought as an absolute truth. Not every anxious thought in your mind deserves your obedience, and not every heavy feeling in your chest is a command that you must follow into the dark. You are fully allowed to care deeply about your work, your family, and your future, without gripping their outcomes so tightly that you crush the space inside your lungs. True letting go does not mean you disappear into a state of cold, unfeeling isolation. It means you develop the capacity to act without forcing the universe to conform to your specific blueprint. You can stand steady within the open spaces of an unchosen transition, recognizing that your life has not been ruined by an abrupt ending, but simply returned to the wide, indestructible water that holds everything. When you stop demanding that a closed door open, you reclaim the energy you were wasting on resistance, leaving your hands weightless and free to rest. Tomorrow, when the first notification catches your attention or an old regret tries to restart its trial in your mind, see if you can offer yourself one small act of quiet discipline. Simply pause, feel the soles of your feet against the floor, and allow the moment to be uncertain. That brief interval of space is where the net opens up under the surface, allowing the freezing undercurrent of modern stress to pass completely through your ribs without catching on any internal defense. You do not have to prove your worth to anyone to deserve a soft pillow and a quiet room tonight, and you do not have to repair your entire history before your body is permitted to let go of its stiffness. You can rest without earning it. You can allow your future to remain unwritten, trusting that the deep, blind buoyancy of your simple presence is fully capable of sustaining you through the fog. As the late night silence expands across your room, notice how the sharp urgencies of your modern obligations begin to lose their definition when you refuse to fight them with your thoughts. The people whose approval you are craving, are currently asleep. The mistakes you are replaying have already dissolved into the irreversible current of the past, and the future you are dreading does not exist anywhere. In the physical world, there is absolutely nothing you can mend from this bed tonight, and no amount of latter night overthinking will ever clear the road ahead. Let the rigid boundaries of your expectations turn soft, allowing your limbs to sink heavily into the immediate support of the mattress. In our final section, this ancient wisdom will dissolve entirely into the dark harbor depths, providing your mind with a gentle path into an undisturbed sleep, where all structures fade away. But for now, let yourself simply be the open wood that watches the tide arrive, a place where the heart can finally stop weaving, and this is where the mind begins to soften. The tide has reached its full height now, and the small harbor village has fallen into a state of total, undisturbed darkness. The distant foghorns have gone silent. The work skiffs are all secured to their mossy pilings, and the great indigo expanse of the bay has become as still as a mirror beneath the low winter clouds. The active hours of learning, reflecting, and translating wisdom into the details of your modern day have naturally fulfilled their purpose. The words themselves are beginning to lose their sharp outlines, dissolving like salt crystals in the deep water, leaving behind only a profound, wordless resonance that is settling directly into the center of your chest. You have traveled far enough through the mist tonight, and your tired mind has carried the burden of its broken blueprints for long enough. Feel how the physical frame of your body has become beautifully, completely heavy, sinking down without resistance into the absolute support of the mattress beneath you. You might imagine that your bed is like that dark, sheltered harbor basin, a place of unconditional depth that requires no effort, no performance, and no preparation from your limbs. You are being held right now by an immense, quiet gravity that does not change its nature, whether your life plans are perfectly whole or completely torn apart. Every microscopic grain of tension you accumulated while trying to control your relationships, every heavy thought of being behind your peers, and every exhausting impulse to replay your past choices can simply slip over the side of your awareness tonight. Let the weight go, allowing the dark undercurrent of sleep to receive your fatigue without asking for a single explanation. The conceptual boundaries that your overthinking has been desperately guarding all evening have no power in this deep quiet. In this dark room, the illusion that you are a separate, fragile structure destined to sink under the weight of an unchosen ending begins to fade out completely. The people whose validation you were chasing, the mistakes you were attempting to fix through shame, and the terrifying void of your unwritten future are all entirely absent from this immediate hour, washed away by the slow, continuous movement of your breath. You do not have to finish weaving a new path before you are allowed to close your eyes, and you do not have to solve the great puzzle of your career or your heart to deserve an undisturbed rest. Let the innermost fibers of your awareness loosen entirely, treating the torso like that loose hempen net that has ceased to fight the sea, letting the dark water move through your ribs without finding anything to break. Let your eyes rest completely behind their lids, feeling the soothing, heavy shadow that blankets your brow, releasing the final, hidden layers of hypervigilance from the tiny muscles around your temples. Let your jaw drop slightly away from your teeth, allowing your neck and shoulders to turn soft and porous, so that your breath moves through you like a quiet, effortless tide sliding over the smooth stones of the shore. Your hands are resting, completely still against the fabric of the bed, open and uncurled, no longer gripping the copper needle of control, no longer trying to force the frayed threads of your life back into a shape that has already passed out of existence. You are entirely safe enough to leave the loose ends exactly as they are right now. The universe is fully capable of spinning through the dark hours without your supervision. Listen closely to the immense, velvety silence that has enveloped the darkness, a quietness that knows no division and carries no expectations. This stillness is not an empty desert that proves you have been abandoned by life. It is the original, indestructible ocean of your own awareness, a depth that remains inherently peaceful, whether the surface water is churned by a sudden gale or settled into absolute tranquility. The seasons of your human existence will bring endings and beginnings, ruptures and harvests, but those passing currents can never diminish the vast space that contains them. You are the sea, not the broken mesh. You are the deep harbor basin, not the passing storm. You are the quiet, water-weighted frame, after the struggle has been surrendered, completely aligned with the rhythmic breath of the world. Let the final frequencies of your overthinking decay, very slowly now, pulsing softer and softer in the shadows. The intervals between your mental commentary becoming wider, deeper, and beautifully distant. Each slow, quiet exhalation carries a tiny speck of your old resistance out into the dark room, diluting the density of your grief until the sorrow runs entirely out of shape. You do not have to earn your place on this earth before the sun rises, and you do not have to prove your sufficiency to a single soul before you are permitted to sleep. The great deep is turning in absolute peace, cradling your skiff, holding your weight, and allowing your spirit to return to its true home. Trust the darkness to hold the pieces. Trust the quiet undercurrent that is pulling you down into the soft, unmonitored waters of a deep, heavy slumber. There is absolutely nothing left to mend, nothing left to force, and nothing left to capture within the spacious chamber of your heart. The knots have been allowed to loosen. The sea stone has balanced the frame, and the water has moved through the tears, turning the open space of your loss into a sanctuary of rest. Let yourself slide completely over the edge of wakefulness, dropping down into that weightless, silent depth where names lose their meanings and the self dissolves into the peace of the sea. What if the future you were trying so desperately to capture was never a distant shoreline, but was always the very ocean that is holding you right now?